next speaker, well, our first interview of the day, ladies and gentlemen, Chris Renner, the CEO of Helios Partners, is a very experienced player in the industry, in projects in Europe and US and Asia. He specialises in brand and rights holder consultancy. And now based in Paris, but he still looks after China. And we're honoured that he's flown all the way here from Paris to join us today. Welcome, Chris. And your interviewer today is my old friend, all the way from China. Please welcome Richard Young, the Managing Director of NFL China, formerly ESPN Star Sports, 100 events in Asian countries, and he speaks, reads and writes Mandarin, so be careful. Good luck.
All right, everybody. We have a gentleman here with 4 winning Olympic bids with Beijing, Vancouver, Sochi, and Pyeongchang. We have one World Cup with Russia World Cup and many other multinational sport events under your belt and in the trophy case, so we want to use you. Let's start with the bad, Qatar. It seems to be going day to day, a bit more pear-shaped. Do you have some insights on that, Chris?
Sure, Richard. I mean, you're right. It is kind of developing day to day. He's referring to the current situation with Qatar 2022 for the FIFA World Cup. And to quote a famous sports prognosticator, Oliver Hardy, it's a fine mess they've gotten themselves into. And it's one that I guess people could have foreseen some time ago when the selection of Qatar was made. Overall, they're kind of in a tough spot because on the one hand, you have selected a country in a long, drawn-out process of selection. There were some questions about that process, but overall it was vetted. The selection was made. People moved on, knowing full well that it was in a country where temperatures during the normal time of year in June for playing and just people being outside was going to be tough. On the other hand, knowing that if you had to change the venue, that would open up a whole new can of worms and questions from the various countries that bid and lost. But if you now look at the scenario being contemplated of flipping it into the winter, the knock-on effects are unbelievable. You've already got the various leagues like Premier League, Bundesliga, and so on saying, well, wait a minute, we're not going to take a month or even more out of our schedules to accommodate that. The money involved is huge. On the other side of the Atlantic, you've got Fox, who's got a huge contract with FIFA for those next 2 World Cups coming up, saying, that's right in the middle of the U.S. football season. That doesn't work. And then you've got some of the bid groups, such as the Australian FA, saying, well, wait a minute, we spent a lot of time and effort here. If you start playing around with the timing and so on, we want another look at how you made your decision. So it's a tough situation to work out of at this point for FIFA, I believe.
Definitely is. And I want to start to tend this towards why and how different countries bid, particularly between Asia and the Western countries for large multinational sports events. But kind of let's take a look at the good in Tokyo. How do you see the Tokyo Games coming about? Was it a good choice? And is there kind of the long run lasting effect for Asia?
Well, there's a lot of implications. And looking at the situation with Qatar right now, and I've been working on the Olympics and within the Olympic movement since the beginning of the 90s, and I've seen the selection process evolve. And of course, the scandal that blew up around the Salt Lake City Games in 1999 did a lot to, I would say, mediate and temper, if you will, the way the IOC went about their process. Now, it's by no means perfect, but they've actually developed 2 rounds. As an example, we worked with Doha when they bid in 2016, and they were left at the gate in the first round of the selection for the Olympic Games for a lot of the reasons and considerations like temperature that FIFA's now wrestling with. And the same was in this case for 2020. There was 2 rounds to the process, so a lot of the initial issues and problems that could have cropped up were kind of knocked on the head. It was a close race up until the last round. I think Tokyo was the safe bet, as they say. I think it's a good one. It does pose the interesting situation for the first time ever of having two Asian cities hosting the Olympic Games, one right after the other, that being the Winter Games in Pyeongchang and Tokyo. And, you know, speaking to some of the points that Greg was talking about earlier, it'll be very interesting to see, as opposed to not one-offs, but single Olympics like Nagano and then Beijing, if having two in a row out in the region can really not only help develop the Olympic movement more, but have a, you know, a lasting effect on things like just sports culture in general in Asia, as well as grassroots and the elements that really are needed to build up sports, whether it's tennis or baseball, football, or otherwise.
I know it's a generalization because there are a lot of variables in both, but you know, there is this thought that there is a rising tide that comes with large-scale sporting events. And do you feel that's true in, especially in Asia, where you have, as in any country, there's far more patriots than there are sports fans, but the gap is much larger in Asia. You have a lot more people following either ethnic or national pride rather than, you know, their team, their club team. And do you feel that that is a bit of a myth, at least in Asia, that this rising tide that you've now sponsored a national coming together, now can you go sponsor the basketball league? Is that a disconnect, or is that something that you do find in the countries?
Well, I think, first of all, the perception that national events and competitions are stronger out in Asia than, say, local and club events remain true. To take an example, the Southeast Asian Games, you know, generally speaking, wouldn't necessarily draw a lot of attention or be successful from a commercial basis just because, you know, of the countries involved not being, quote unquote, perceived as strong sporting countries in a lot of ways, but in fact, they're very strong. They get a strong following throughout the 10 countries. There's a lot of passion for the teams. It's an opportunity for Malaysia to go against Singapore in badminton, or Thailand to go against Indonesia in sepak takraw, in sports that generally don't get a lot of interest, but they're fighting for medals. People get excited and get interested, and it's grown quite nicely over the years. On the other hand, you know, there still aren't a lot of strong, you know, professional leagues throughout Asia where people can really identify with clubs on an ongoing basis and say, you know, that's my team. You know, they're going to the knockout phase of the FA Cup or whatever. You've got certainly some examples of that, like the J League in Japan. And I think China is still trying to evolve with the Super League and get beyond some of the corruption issues and make that a true and viable league. But until, you know, those strong leagues develop, you're still going to see much more interest, I think, in national teams.
And is that a part of, you know, knowing that the rights holders for these games want to have a lasting effect? Do they take into account the strength of the domestic club leagues, the strength of the leagues, so that the use of facilities and the use of, well, basically the rising tide is something that continues on? Or do you think that that's an area that needs to be improved upon?
Well, I do. I'll take two examples, and one's right here. You know, I came out to Hong Kong for the first time in 1995 with ISL to set up their Asia-Pacific operations and prepare for the World Cup that took place in Japan and Korea in 2002. So I've seen a lot of change and development. I also lived in for 5 years in Beijing in the lead up to the games. And one thing I've noted is how, when I moved to Hong Kong, it was almost by default the hub for sport in Asia. And I do mean by default because there wasn't really a city that had the concentration of media and wealth to do it. But I've seen Singapore steal their thunder a little bit, or maybe a lot, and make a concerted effort, whether it's through legislation or what's going on with the sports hub, and you see what's happened with F1 and so on, and now we have WTA coming with their World Championships. You know, a really concerted effort, and it's been over a long period of time because there are a lot of stops and starts. I've watched closely over the last 15 years, but it's now to a point that you can have conferences like this, but that's a strategy. That's a corporate citywide strategy or mentality to make it happen and to become, you know, as they say, a sports hub. And then I look at Beijing, who had the opportunity with the games to really put on what most people agreed was probably the biggest and best organized games ever. Hugely successful from the point of view of presenting China on the world stage. Mission accomplished for, you know, the Politburo and the central government in presenting a competent government, which was the goal. But going back up to Beijing this week, and I go by the Bird's Nest, the Water Cube, and all those great facilities, and they're massively underused. There really are. They're more monuments than they are sporting facilities. They're monuments to a great job well done by a country, but as far as utilization and getting the benefit from that infrastructure, it wasn't there because there wasn't a whole integrated strategy to that. And I think Singapore is a good example of it.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think recently I read that SportCal selected China as the #1 sporting major events host for the last 20 years, or in a 20-year period. That surprised me, I'll be honest, because I have the same opinions, I think, as you do. I don't find a lot of follow-up. I find a lot of sponsorship of the nation rather than the sponsorship of the sport. How do you see that?
Well, I'm surprised in the sense that you have to wonder if China's getting everything out of the games that they should. Beyond right after the Summer Games of 2008, you had the Asian Games in 2010. You've had the FINA Swimming Championships. You're going to have the Youth Olympic Games. Let's see, we've got a few others coming down the track too. But in Nanjing. But the question is it, and China's a big country, granted, but is it done in an integrated way to accomplish any bigger goal? And China's very good at 5- and 10-year plans. And from a sporting point of view, some of it's infrastructure, but then when you see if it flows out into the grassroots, develops a sporting culture, and really gets kids excited about participating in sport, I wonder about that. And you see it in other countries. Korea's also been very successful in winning big sporting events, but it's almost a shotgun approach. So they look down the calendar, they say, I see that we've got the Youth Olympic Games coming up, we've got the East Asian Games coming up, we've got the World Wrestling Championships coming up, let's go for all of it. And I'm not saying that's a built-in strategy, but I think there could be more of an integrated approach to which sports make sense, how can we time them right, how can we use it to build more of a sporting culture in our country.
So it does seem that, again, in fear of making too much of a generalization, that there is a bit of a difference for why and how Asian countries bid as opposed to possibly European and American countries bid. And what do you think is necessary to kind of take Asia to that next level, to have it not just be kind of national grandstanding, so that it's not just the idea of, which is what the feeling was with Beijing Olympics very much, that it was put on for a specific show. Whether you had fun or not was optional. But it was going to be a well-timed mechanical show that highlighted the rise of China to the rest of the world. What do you think is necessary for Asia to kind of make that next step from national grandstanding really into becoming a sporting power?
Well, it is interesting if you look at statistics. Probably 20 years ago, if you looked at the medal count of the various continents, Asia would show up with about 10%. That's now, based on the London results, well over 25%. Granted, a lot of that's driven by the China powerhouse and the number of medals they win, but you're seeing a lot more medals coming out of places like Korea. You're seeing, one-off individual medals coming from places over the years like Hong Kong, even Taiwan, Thailand, so on and so forth. So you are seeing from a sports performance basis, Asia definitely coming up. They're a power. And now having, again, 2 games come back to the region is certainly going to help, because we always see the hometown effect when the host countries deliver a lot of medals. So, I mean, if the focus does shift a little bit more over to sports and performance, that's all to the good. But, it's a long-term process. Some of it's cultural and built in. I mean, you look at the Aussies, they eat, breathe, and sleep with sport. It's a natural thing, and they punch above their weight, normally speaking, when it comes to performance in all kinds of sports. So, you can't change that overnight, and some would argue you shouldn't change it overnight. But, being exposed more to big level sports, it stimulates and excites the market, and I think does lead to more development. And again, I think Singapore, being really a relatively small place, is a good example. I'll be interested to see how the gold medal count goes for them over the next 20 years to see if that also trickles out that far.
Right, right. And I know that Helios is certainly best known for their bid management consulting, but you also do a lot of brand consulting. And how does that affect, especially out in Asia? Obviously, we're here and we want to talk about Asia, but in Asia, how do you consult with your brands in actually either transitioning from really sponsoring a national moment into a far more focused and more niche category with regards to their sponsorship and activating that and connecting with the people who have that interest?
Yeah, it's a good question. Even working with longtime Olympic sponsors who have been around the block and either sponsored the top global program or big brands that come in and sponsor a one-off Olympics like London, I'm surprised how many drop the whole legacy and positive Olympic afterglow opportunity that's there right after a Games. I mean, there's never really been a Games that's been a failure. There are some that have been better than others, but normally speaking, when they're over, there is quite, a warm feeling about the Games, the success, people are happy, and yet I don't see sponsors kind of following through on that very often. And I think that's something that's missing. It's something missing for sponsors who invested up to $100 million just in the rights, but also in kind of building with the communities, some kind of lasting legacy, whether it's in the form of venues or programs or so on. And I think that is an opportunity that can be developed. That said, we did work with FedEx. They sponsored the Chinese badminton team for a number of years, and as you probably know, they're kind of the dream team of China. They basically scoop up all the gold medals when they compete. They've got some big stars like Lin Dan that capture. They're like a lot of athletes in the West. Captures a lot of interest beyond just sport, and FedEx was able to really associate with that, and they built it into a number of grassroots and charitable programs in China, and they did that for quite a long time, and it went beyond the Olympic Games, and I think they saw a lot of benefit. Of course, it helped as well because they're more B2B than they are B2C, and they use that in a lot of programs that they built in for their clients to come and enjoy the events, meet the stars, and so on, and that gave it some lasting impact too.
Mm. So we've talked a little bit about the country and the sponsorship adapting to kind of carry on the effects of a major event. Do you see the Olympics actually adapting anymore? I mean, obviously, I think it was about 6 years ago, or more than that they split between the winter and the Summer Olympics in different years. Do you see another major development like that, either for the Olympics or for major multi-sport games coming up?
I do, actually. The Olympics have, under Samaranch, they made a number of changes. They became much more commercial. They did split the games, which I thought was very intelligent, just to give a true kind of 4-year platform for sponsors. They have made some reforms following the Salt Lake City scandal as far as how they manage the members and the selection process. The next big thing, which President Rogge made an effort to address before he left, was really doing a better job of connecting with youth, because it's a problem for the IOC. I mean, I know I've got 3 kids. They've been to the Beijing Games, they've been to the London Games, they do sport, and yet, during the course of the games, they may pick it. First of all, most kids today don't even watch TV, okay? Almost everything they consume is online, at least in my household. I don't know if that's good or bad. But they follow everything, including sports, online. And so the traditional TV appointment kind of viewing just doesn't match in with the way their day proceeds. And they, for the most part, they still love sport. They enjoy it. But the regimented, regulated process of, this game's going to be on then, or this playoff's going to happen then, and you may lose the team you follow, doesn't really appeal as much. And, we've seen that in the Olympic ratings amongst youth. I mean, old geezers like us, we keep the ratings up there pretty well. But it's generally a downward trend. And so, Rogge created the Youth Olympic Games. Quite honestly, it's had mixed results. I think it was somewhat a knee-jerk reaction to say, we need to connect with youth. We have the Olympic Games. Well, let's just call them the Youth Olympic Games, and youth will show up and youth will pay attention. And it hasn't worked out that way. What you really have are an Olympic Games without any of the major athletes that draw people's attention and win the big gold medals. You've got great young kids who are going to develop and be stars of the future, we hope. But I know my kids aren't going to either turn on the TV or get online to follow any of that. So that's not necessarily the answer to really reconnecting with youth. And I do think the process we saw down in Buenos Aires, where they, literally wrestled with wrestling and threw them out for 5 months and said, oops, that's a mistake. They've been around for 5,000 years. We got to let them back in. But they had sports like sports climbing and squash, and our friends at baseball try to get back in, and then selected wrestling again. It just kind of questions, well, are you really about revitalizing and rejuvenating the sports that are on offer and sports that connect not only with youth, but people in Asia or in other areas besides Europe? And that's another area where they need to really look and work hard. And there are questions coming out of Buenos Aires as to whether that selection process is flawed or needs to be reworked. And frankly, whether the cap needs to be 26 sports. As Dick Pound, an IOC member, said, it's like, what do you do, just stick your hand and pull a name out of a jar for a sport? Why not more sports, but maybe control the number of disciplines there? And I think that's an area where they need to look if they do want to expand the appeal of the games.
Right. Yeah. I've heard a couple of ideas, and one of them I like is splitting between team sports on one year and then individual sports on another year. And doing that for the Winter Olympics is a little bit more difficult on that, but Summer Olympics. But it does seem that while they talk about engaging with the youth, they can't seem to get over themselves on a lot of these things, because they continue to make decisions that kind of perpetuate its position. And you see a little bit of the kickback from Rio, and over the years there has been a real ebb and flow, and older guys like us can see that when in '84, it was the IOC really almost begging Los Angeles as the only city that was willing to air it, willing to host the game, begging them to host the games, and then now to everybody kind of treating it like the royal visit. And do you see that kind of ebb and flow going if they don't make some changes, or is it going from strength to strength? Well,
not coincidentally, coming back to LA. LA was the only games that ever truly turned a profit. Now, you don't want to judge games by that, all right? It can be a little American sometimes, what was the bottom line, but they were profitable in every sense of the word. They delivered those games at no cost to the city, and it left a $250 million legacy 30 years ago, and they invested it into a sports fund, which to this day delivers great athletes out of California. We get a load of our gold medals, by the way, out of California, in Southern California. And my point to that is simply that because the city was able to stage the games on their own terms and not sign some huge host city contract, they were able to run it profitably and well. And it was seen as overall a sustainable, great games. Before sustainable was a cool word. And the question is, as we look beyond Tokyo now, because Tokyo is going to be probably in pretty much the old format, can we work with cities to develop a more sustainable concept where we don't leave behind these huge monuments that really aren't about sports anymore and that can be used and help grow sports and culture, and that's really thought through. London, to be fair, got about halfway there, and it'll be interesting to see what it does on the East End in London for building up the community in sport. And they've also did a cool thing. They could dismantle facilities like the basketball arena and ship it off to other events to be used. So there's a movement to that, but I just think the gigantism and everything of the games is going to become more and more of an issue. And the IOC really needs to take a hand in that and say, look, we don't need necessarily a brand new 100,000 seat stadium. You have one that's 80,000, let's refurbish it, let's make it work so it can be used by, the local football club and, local fans in the future.
So I think I'm getting a nod here, so probably the last question. What for Asia and particularly, I think we're talking about primarily East Asia, where most of our experience is that going to be commercially driven? Is that going to be required that there are going to be major brands that come out of East Asia that utilize sport to further their area? Do you see that building up and there being more of an export out of Asia, rather than the import that is really much, it's quite a trade imbalance if you look at it, as there's foreign leagues coming in, there are foreign sponsors coming in to try and take advantage of the China or the East Asian market. Do you see that, and how quickly do you see that reversing itself, or if ever?
Yeah, it's a critical question. Since I came out here 20 years ago, there's been incremental development and change. We've gone from, basically China setting up professional basketball and football leagues back in the early 90s, almost completely supported by tobacco brands, now to leagues that have a spread of big consumer-oriented sponsorship brands, which immediately help because you've got these big marketing-savvy brands that are out there promoting to consumers on a regular basis, as opposed to one big brand that's not exactly the top of the list of favorite industries, just basically dominating to sell cigarettes. So we've seen progress on the commercial side. We've seen progress on the infrastructure side, a lot of it led by these major Asian cities hosting big events. Where we haven't seen the development as much as I would have hoped is on the individual athlete basis, in the sense of creating stars. Okay, I mentioned Lin Dan earlier, who's almost like a household name in China. But if you try to think of, who's the Tiger Woods or the David Beckham or the Michael Jordan or so on and so forth, beyond Asia, you struggle a little bit. And so I think until there is maybe not a star culture, but homegrown, organically developed athletes are developed and can be quote unquote exported, whether it's through cricket or baseball, as that's happening in the major leagues. And then you saw the impact of a Yao Ming. One guy from China shows up in the NBA and has a massive impact, not only in China, but in the US. We just need more of that. And if we can, and you can get a critical mass of that, I think other things will follow. Their endorsements will follow. The leagues will grow behind them in their path. Infrastructure will be built behind them. But most importantly, kids want to be like them. They will idolize them. They'll not only buy their jerseys, but hopefully get into their sports and participate. And I think there needs to be a closer look at what kind of platform is needed, not just developing a grassroots, but also, with the media, turning them into stars so that can happen. And that's almost maybe it's the tail wagging the dog, in the sense of, it's obvious, but it hasn't really been developed, and it's smaller on the scale of the revenues we saw Greg put up, but it's absolutely critical.
Or the tobacco days come back. That's the only way.
About that, I doubt
Chris,
that.
thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Chris and Richard for very interesting insights and discussion.